Hey everybody, this is Oliver Joyce from Whiskeybarrel Studios, and I'm outside getting a little bit of vitamin D, a little bit of sunshine. Today I wanted to do something a little bit different from the usual game dev stuff. I wanted to talk about something that is very close to me, and that is books, and in particular today, fantasy books. Fantasy novels, the fantasy genre is, probably my favorite genre, and the genre that has inspired me the most from my own game dev and that kind of thing. So I just wanted to go through basically 10 of my favorite fantasy novels. The order of these things is always very subjective, because who's to say whether one book is better than another, and it's very arbitrary just in terms of, is number 7 better than number 5. This is just my personal top 10, but I've got my trusty cup of tea here, and we're going to go through them now 10 to 1, and I'll tell you a little bit about each book and why I recommend it. Alright, so book number 10 on my list is this one, The Sum of All Men by David Farland. This is a book I picked up 20 years ago. This was written in May 1999, so I picked this up new, and it's a really just a fun story. It's all about fantasy, basically fantasy superheroes. So a bunch of lords get given powers from their subjects using these brands, these runes, and so they basically put these runes into a hot forge, they brand the subject, and then they take from them a power. So the power might be something like, I'm going to take your strength, then I become twice as strong, but you become twice as weak. Or I might take your beauty, and I become twice as beautiful, and you become half as beautiful. And now what's the catch for the, why would you want to do this if you were the subject? Well, the thing is, I'm then become honor bound to protect you. So the lords of the realm take these powers and protect their subjects, who basically do it out of love. And so you have these basically superheroes walking around that are like 8 times stronger than a regular human, or 8 times faster or smarter and so on, protecting their subjects. And then when they die, the power goes back to the giver of the power. But it's all about how a bunch of these lords have to fight against one evil lord who's basically sort of subjecting his people and forcing them. And so he's going around taking hundreds and hundreds of strength runes and hundreds of different powers, and just becoming this just badass bad guy called Raj Arten. And this is, it's kind of a pulpy sort of novel. There is a series of them. I think it's called The Rune Lords. I read the first 4 and I didn't go any further, but at the time I really just enjoyed the story. I wouldn't say it's the best written story, but it's very much a fast-paced, good sort of action, I was going to say RPG, but action fantasy novel. So that's number 10, The Sum of All Men. Okay, so number 9 on the list is by Bernard Cornwell, and it's called Excalibur. Now, if you know the name Bernard Cornwell, it's because he's best known for writing The Last Kingdom, which is a major Netflix series about Vikings, and he does a lot of really great historical novels. This one really gripped me. It's technically a fantasy novel because there's sort of implied magic in it, and it's an Arthurian legend, which is, one of the oldest kind of fantasies we have, that and the sort of Nordic fantasy. This is basically the classic tale of King Arthur, told by one of Arthur's close friends, a warrior called Durfel Codan, which I'm probably butchering the name, but he's a sort of a Welsh name. But this is a really a beautiful trilogy of the Excalibur books, all about King Arthur and the betrayal of Sir Lancelot, and the evil sort of Morgan Le Fay and Merlin. And the kind of cool thing about it is Merlin is a wizard in this, of course, but he's a bit of a trickster, and everything is, is it really magic? Is it not magic? It's hard to say. So this, almost qualifies as a historical novel rather than a fantasy novel, but it's beautifully told, and it's written from Durfel's perspective many years later when he's a monk, and it's sort of retelling his story of how he got to know the mighty King Arthur and the truth behind the legend. And it's got fantastic battles, a lot of wistful scenes, and if you're into Arthurian legends, Bernard Cornwell's Excalibur, highly recommend at number 9. Okay, so number 8 on the list, The Baker's Boy by J.V. Jones. This is book one in a trilogy called The Book of Words. I read this first again as a 18, 19-year-old, and it stuck with me because it was really quite brutal and quite almost sort of Game of Thrones before Game of Thrones, in terms of a fantasy novel that had sort of violence and sex and just politicking and that kind of thing, in an era when a lot of the fantasy that I'd read had been quite high fantasy and a little bit more sort of Dungeons and Dragonsy. But I reread this one last year, and boy does it hold up. It is just a fantastic story, and it's all about the titular Baker's Boy, who is a boy who lives in a castle and discovers he has magic powers. It's a classic fantasy trope, but he basically goes through absolute hell. The magic in this book, whenever you cast magic, it takes a lot out of you. You end up sort of tasting this horrible metallic taste, and then you blast the magic out, and then you're sick for days. And he has to learn how to harness his magic, because he is a very dangerous boy, basically. But there's an evil wizard called Borealis, who's sort of been prophesied that somebody will kill him, this guy here, and he's sort of trying to stop this. But it's all about a magician, a knight that tries to protect him, a girl who's a princess that goes with him. Classic fantasy stuff, but it's written in a really sort of gritty way, and quite funny in parts, because the bad guys are they're always scheming against each other, and it's quite a compelling world. So I really recommend this one. It's not a very well-known fantasy novel, but I've read this a bunch of times. There's also a sequel to this called, I can't remember what the trilogy is, but it's A Sword from Red Ice, A Sword from Black Ice, and so on. I've read 3 of the 4 books of those, but years and years ago. I'm going to go back to them and revisit them sometime, but highly recommend this one, The Baker's Boy. Number 7 on this list is going to be one that will be most people's, or many people's, top 3, or very high. This is a novel that is beloved by many people, beloved by myself. I've read it 3 or 4 times. It is, of course, Raymond Feist's Magician, and I reread the whole series a couple of years ago, because I like to reread things, stories that are close to my heart. I read this as a teenager, and then read it again in my 20s, read it again in my 30s, read it again in my 40s. I debated whether to put this in my top 3. This could really be up there. If you look at the books that are above it, you could probably say, yeah, they deserve to be above it. But this is if you have not read a good fantasy novel before, this is not a bad place to start. This is an absolute classic story about, again, a magician who called Pug, who wakes up, finds he has powers. You get a sense of a familiar story here, because this is a classic sort of the hero archetype that Joseph Campbell talked about, the hero's journey. But this one spans worlds. Basically, this guy discovers he has powers, takes him to another planet. He gets involved in battles against other wizards and huge wars going on. His best friend Thomas discovers he basically turns into a huge ancient warrior called a Valhiru. This is the first book in basically a series of 30 or maybe more, called the Mycemia series, the Rift War, and basically spawning different trilogies and so on. This first trilogy is the best, the Magician trilogy, and then the Serpent War saga is also excellent. It goes downhill after that. There are some shining lights, but one of Raymond Feist's strengths is writing characters like wizards and warriors and that kind of thing. Doesn't write female characters very well. They're very one-dimensional, and it gets quite repetitive. And also it tends to sort of fall into the lazy sort of teenage romance trope. At his best, it's amazing. The Magician is probably his best work by far. If you go through the series, it does get weaker and weaker, and you kind of feel like he melts it in. That's why I didn't rate this book higher. But if you've never read Magician before, you'll do yourself a favour. Alright, if you thought number 7 was a big name, wait till you see number 6, which, honestly is most people's number 1. That is probably the grandfather of all fantasy. The Lord of the Rings. This book needs no introduction, but here it is, The Lord of the Rings by J.R.R. Tolkien. And if you're wondering why this copy seems so new, it's because I actually haven't read it. My old copy of it basically fell apart. I read it so much that it's fallen to bits, and that was a copy from many, many years ago. This book is the novel upon which all fantasy novels are pretty much based for the last century or so on. Why isn't this number one for me? It could be, but the reason is, I actually, and this is going to sound blasphemous, I prefer the movies. These days, if I want to experience The Lord of the Rings, I'll dive into the movies and get my good 12 hours. You've got to watch the extended editions, of course. None of this watching the theatrical cuts. You've got to watch the extended editions, but Lord of the Rings has everything. It has a cast of 9 heroes going on an epic quest to save the world. You're all familiar with The Lord of the Rings. Another reason it's not higher for me is because it is a slow burn, I'm not going to lie, especially when you're used to sort of the faster pace of the movies and so on. There are a lot of poems, and this is a lot of description of landscapes, and when you're in the mood for it, it is a compelling, beautiful read, but it can be slow, and I feel like I don't go back to it as often as I used to, because there are so many other great books out there, and life's too short to sort of read the same book again and again and again and again. Although, a funny story, Christopher Lee, who played Saruman, the wizard Saruman, he read this every single year until he died at 98 or whatever it is. But Saruman read this every year, which I think is kind of cool. Christopher Lee. So yeah, Lord of the Rings. If you haven't read this, basically turn off the video and go read it, because you're not going to get a better fantasy story than this in terms of like the big daddy of them all. Although on the other hand, it's very long, and I don't care about the Silmarillion or the appendices and so on. I love the meat and bones of this story, but yeah, it's long and has a lot of names. So number 5, classic. Oh, sorry, number 6. Okay, number 5 is another classic, and this one is William Goldman's The Princess Bride. Oh, should I say S. Morgenstern's The Princess Bride. Debatably a fantasy novel. It's an adventure story, but it has miracles, it has giants, fighting, fencing, true love. It's got everything. This, if you're not familiar with The Princess Bride, this was a cult classic. The book was written, in the 70s, I believe. Let's have a look. This is the 25th edition version, which I had in 1998. So yeah, 1973 by William Goldman, who's a screenwriter who also did, Taxi Driver and Raging Bull and that kind of thing. So he was, a heavy hitter in Hollywood. But he wrote this book under the sort of pseudonym S. Morgenstern. And so basically, if you've seen the movie but haven't read the book, the movie is an absolute cult classic, and I saw the movie many times before I had read the book. But the book is kind of a funny one, because it's almost told as like a long-lost novel written by this S. Morgenstern character, and William Goldman has rediscovered it. And, it has sort of a lot of bits in it, and he sort of abridges it with like, for the next 20 pages, Morgenstern talks all about the fashion of Gildor, or the the cuisine that they eat at the royal ball and that kind of thing. So it's a very funny story, and the first 10-15 pages are all about sort of the introduction of why he wrote the book, because his 2 daughters wanted a princess and a bride. He says, "I've got your story. What do you want?" A story with princesses and brides. That's why the funny title of it. But this is a classic story. It's very close to my heart. My wife loves it as well. We can quote this movie to every single line. We introduced our boys to it the other night, and they love it. My youngest was going around saying, "Prepare to die," and we were saying, okay, maybe don't say that at daycare. But yeah, debatably a fantasy novel, but this could be number 1 too. If you watched the movie, haven't read the book, very funny and well worth it. And it even has a bonus chapter called Buttercup's Baby, which was this long lost chapter or something like that of the sequel to Princess Bride. Did you know there was a sequel, Buttercup's Baby? It was never written. He sort of did this first chapter. William Goldman did that first chapter to tease us. Unfortunately, Goldman died a few years ago, so there will never be a Buttercup's baby, and hopefully there never will be. On that note as well, I hope they never reboot Princess Bride. I don't want it recast. I don't want it redone. You cannot improve on perfection. Alright, I just want to give a quick shout out to my Patreon supporters: Neighbor Jack, Dane Simoneau, Daniel Funches, Brandon K, Pipuch, Noah Gudajan, X Up Omega, Jeff of Hex 3D, Hopeless, and Michael Babb. Thanks guys, your support is much appreciated, and if you'd like to be a patron of Whiskeybarrel Studios, I'll leave a link in the channel below. Alright, on with the rankings. Now we're into our top 4, and it's funny looking at these books again. Every time I read one I think, oh, that one should be higher. I look at Lord of the Rings, should be higher, Magician should be higher. I could actually potentially rate this one. Right now it's number 4, but this could slide right back depending on what how the third book goes. But this is the infamous, famous/infamous The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss. Now, the reason I say this is infamous is because this guy has a case of the George R.R. Martins, in that he's taking a long time to write these books. He wrote the first one, then a few years later he wrote the second one, and now it's been something like 10 years, and the third volume still hasn't come out. So let's see when this one was written. Okay. 2007. Book 2. So, okay, we're talking 16 years. So this is, okay. But at its heart, this is a beautiful and brilliant novel about a magician. Are you sensing that theme here? Who, and it's a storyteller, basically. It's a man called Kvoth who is telling a story to another man in a tavern about his youth and how he became this great legendary figure. And then so he tells a tale, and it's almost sort of like he's making up things as he goes along. And you kind of, do I believe him? Do I not? He's a bit of a Gary Sue in terms of those characters that can do everything, is never wrong. But it's sort of implied that that's a little bit tongue in cheek. But this first book is all about him going to a magic university, a la Harry Potter, that kind of thing, but done in a really brilliant way. And it's just a stunningly told story, and very character driven. Not a lot of battles and violence or anything, just very cleverly done, all about his journey from a young thief across the sea to become a great magician, and then in the second book he travels to work in a palace and that kind of thing. But fantastic story. I'm still waiting for book 3, and so is everyone else. And Patrick Rothfuss has had a bit of a controversial sort of run lately, and too, with tax avoidance and a few weird things on social media and so on. So people are kind of losing a bit of faith in him and book 3 ever coming out. So that's the only reason I don't rate this one higher, and I could rate it lower. But when I read this was like, I said to my wife, this is my favorite fantasy novel. This is amazing. I love it. You've got to read it. And book 2 is not quite as good. It could do with a little bit of editing. It's probably too long, but there are parts of it that you go, this is so good. And stuff in there that you've never seen in any other kind of fantasy novel. Languages of people talking with their hands. This brilliant sort of financial system that doesn't sound like fun, but it's actually fun to read. Great, music, and when I say music, he plays music, and you really get to know this world in this small world. It doesn't really feel like this sort of vast epic world, but unlike any other kind of fantasy novel. Highly recommend it, but maybe wait until the third book comes out, if it ever comes out. We'll see. Fingers crossed. Speaking of long-awaited novels, this man also needs no introduction. It is George R.R. Martin's Game of Thrones, also known as A Song of Ice and Fire. Book 1 is, of course, Game of Thrones. And, for a while there, this was the most popular IP in the world. This was the heavy-hitting show that everybody was talking about. Almost like the last piece of monoculture. Because if you remember a few years ago, there were a bunch of 8 seasons of Game of Thrones, and this was a show that everybody was talking about. You go to work and everybody was asking about, who was Jon Snow's parents, what evil things was Cersei up to, what happens to the Night's Watch, what about the dragons and that kind of thing. It was incredible, because this was basically the novel that sort of brought fantasy to the masses in a way, via the TV show, but it it was unusual because my mum was watching it. You know, my friends who basically into sports have no interest in fantasy, they were all watching it and talking about knights and wizards and dragons and that kind of thing. And, you know, just a stunning story. And one of the cool things about at least the first sort of 3 books of Game of Thrones, especially, was George R.R. Martin's knack of just subversion. You know, basically subverting expectations in that, you know, who you think is the hero is going to die. You know, spoiler alert. You know, Ned Stark. You think he's the hero, then halfway through book 1, oh yeah, by the way, spoilers in this video. Please turn them off if you haven't, you know, already caught up on Game of Thrones, which you probably should. You know, turns out he dies. He's not even the hero. You think, what's going on? And then the next, Robb Stark, is he the hero? He dies, and so on and so on and so on. And it is just a fantastic story told from the perspective of many different characters, from Daenerys the Dragon Queen to Tyrion the Imp, to, of course, the Stark family and the evil Lannisters and so on. An epic story that sprawled out and sprawled out and sprawled out, and George R. Martin just has taken many years to sort of expand the story. Book 5 came out at least 10 years ago. I'm going to say probably about 12 years ago. I don't have it with me, but we're still waiting on Dance of Dragons, which is book 6, and he keeps sort of teasing it and saying, it's coming, but he's long past the deadline. And I think we all know what happened with the TV show and how disappointed people were with the ending. You know, I'm not going to talk about that. I'd like to rewatch it one day through, you know, the lens of, you know, knowing what happens and hopefully not being as disappointed, because I remember watching it at the moment and being, this is amazing, this is cool, but then, you know, on reflection going, yeah, you know, they kind of rushed that, or hey, what was that all about? And some questionable decisions, and you know, it looked and felt great, but the character motivations were just not there anymore. And of course, what happened was that they ran out of material, because he's still writing the books, but the studio runners started making up their own stories and using his basic beats, but then, you know, they decided they didn't want to work on it anymore. The D&D guys, what were they for? I forgot their name. Benioff and Weiss. It was disappointing. They basically said, we want to go off and do Star Wars. We're going to just rush this series. Anyway, if you haven't read the books, there are a few changes, but the show was pretty faithful to it. But there's a lot more depth in the books, and a lot more backstory and world building. And he's great at world building. He's great at expanding the world. What he needs is an editor, though. So this story keeps expanding. I think he's having trouble reining it back in. When I was reading this, though, this felt like something completely different. This is, you know, absolutely a top 3 fantasy novel of all time for me, and, you know, for most people. We're all waiting for it to be finished. We don't know if it will. You know, he's got this novel and another one to do. He's not getting any younger. Maybe Brandon Sanderson will finish it off. Who knows? It's one of those things. But Game of Thrones, Song of Ice and Fire. Currently 5 books in the series, waiting on 6, and touchwood, waiting on 7. Number 2 is almost like the polar opposite of George R.R. Martin in terms of how prolific this guy is. And it's not Brandon Sanderson, because I've never read any Brandon Sanderson stuff. Stormlight Archives, that kind of thing. I've been recommended to it, and I would love to read it sometime. Wheel of Time is Robert Jordan's books that Brandon Sanderson finished. This guy's a prolific author, but I'm not talking about Brandon Sanderson today. I'm talking about Joe Abercrombie. This, my friends, is a hell of a story. This is called The Blade Itself, and it's part of the first Law trilogy. And the reason I say it's prolific is because he has done, I'm going to say 9 or 10 books at least. I can't remember exactly. I've bought all of them except the last trilogy. I'm making my way through them. I only discovered this series late last year. I've read the first 4 books. And this first book, The Blade Itself, was written in 2006. So he's done 9 or 10 books in 15 years. So he's basically averaging a book every year and a half or something like that. So Joe Abercrombie, The Blade Itself. What is this about, and why is it so highly rated? Well, you're in for a treat. This is just an awesome story. You know, this, funny enough, this sort of came around, you know, around the time of Game of Thrones, around the same decade. I wish I'd known about this back then, because I would have loved it back then as I love it now. It is a grim fantasy world where there's magic, there's monsters and so on, but we're not talking trolls and orcs and dragons and that kind of thing. We're talking humans and sort of religious monstrosities, wizards. Wizards aren't trusted. No one believes there's any magic in the world, and when you see a wizard, they kind of go, yeah, what's that guy about? He's not a real wizard. But, you know, the wizards are devastatingly powerful and far and few between. All the characters in this book are just, they're just the anti-heroes. And if you like anti-heroes, which I do, this is full of them. And you have a barbarian called Logan the Bloody Nine. Logan Nine Fingers, for obvious reasons. He missing a finger from a battle, and who is just this barbarian who wants to make good in the world, but just whenever he sees red, wakes up and there's bodies everywhere. He's on a quest with a sort of a foppish swordsman and who looks a little bit sort of like a Robert Pattinson character, and you know he's never done a hard day of work in his life. He's got, you know, clean fingers and so on. Good swordsman, but you know, not into battles. But for some reason he has to go on the quest as well. You've got an old Gandalf style wizard who's kind of built like a blacksmith, but instead of being like Gandalf, everyone hates him. So this guy tells these stories. Everyone's bored by the stories. This guy's grumpy. He doesn't know what he's doing half the time. You've got this dreadlocked, dark-skinned, absolute killer who goes with them as well, who hates everybody, doesn't want to be there. You have the classic fantasy story where they're going over hills, but she's sort of walking 100 meters behind everyone because she can't stand them. This is part of a trilogy, The First Law. I smashed through these, and I'm now reading the fourth book, which is set some years after, also set in the world, A Tale of Revenge, called Best Served Cold. I can't get enough of this world and Joe Abercrombie as a writer, and I'm stunned that there is not a fantasy series about it. Why hasn't HBO done this? This is every bit as intriguing as Game of Thrones, and there's more of it. Please do yourself a favor and check out The Blade itself. Alright, we come to it at last. Number one on the list, and thank you all for being with me over this last half an hour. This is really just for the book fans. I imagine most of you who sort of followed me for Sword and Sandals Read stuff have tuned out long ago, but if you're still interested, I appreciate you being around and just being able to share a little bit of, you know, my hobbies and a bit more about me and, you know, what I like, because there's more to me than just making games, as more to you. Before I get to number one, I'd also love to know what your top fantasy novels are. Please write in the comments, and if you have any recommendations that I haven't tried yet. Again, I haven't read any Brandon Sanderson stories. I've read some of the Wheel of Time. At the time, I read the first 3 books and then didn't grab me. I haven't read any of the Shannara books and everything like this. I don't like bad fantasy or really pulp fantasy, but having said that, wait till you see number one. But, you know, if I have a soft spot for it, I'm keen to check it out. So let's check out number one, shall we? Drum roll, please. Number one on my top 10 fantasy novels is The Dragonlance Chronicles. You're going to go, what? The Dragonlance Chronicles? They are so pulpy. There's 3 books in the Dragonlance Chronicles by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. And why these books? This is actually a compendium of all 3 books. Why is this my number one? That's a great question, and I had to ask myself that. And you know, I look at those books there, and most of them, at least the top 6 or so, could be my number one. But you know me, I am a nostalgic soul at heart, and I do like to go back to my youth. And believe it or not, the Dragonlance Chronicles were the first fantasy novel I ever read. Before the Belgariad, before the Lord of the Rings, before the Hobbit and everything, I was given Dragons of Autumn Twilight, which is the first volume in this one, and that just opened my mind to a world of fantasy. I was given that, and I was given the Dungeons and Dragons red box, which is like the starter kit for Dungeons and Dragons, with a little wax sort of thing and a dice that you kind of rub out the letters on, the numbers. And this, I couldn't believe it. This just, it had everything I didn't know I wanted. It had knights, it had wizards, it had dragons, it had elves, it had dwarves. I mean, I don't really like elves, to be honest, but it had everything. And because I hadn't read The Lord of the Rings, this was all new to me. The Dragonlance Chronicles is, of course, a Dungeons and Dragons novel. It's based on a campaign that the authors were playing. They were playing a Dungeons and Dragons character with their characters, and they thought, this is quite a cool story, we should write it up. And so they did. And, like, let's look at this objectively. This is not the greatest fantasy novel of all time. Not by a long shot. There are books on there that run rings around this in terms of narrative, in terms of story creation, in terms of craft. But you can't get much more of a classic fantasy adventure than this. And it does read like a D&D campaign as well, because the characters do things that you're not quite sure. And this does feel a lot like it's heavily inspired by Lord of the Rings in terms of you have a party of adventurers. They meet at a tavern and they go off on a big quest to save the world, kind of thing. It's all about dragons and wizards and all that kind of stuff, but it's entertaining, and it has some classic characters in there. Every character is pretty much an archetype. You have the proud but sad knight, Sturm Brightblade. You have the dumb but good-hearted barbarian in Caramon. You have the evil wizard Raistlin. Actually, Raistlin's probably the only character in the book who has any kind of real depth to him. Maybe Raistlin and Tarnus Half-Elven, who has this sort of half-elf, half-human conflict going on in his mind. It deals with sort of racism and that kind of thing, which, in a book which is fairly simple, it's nice to see a little bit of depth to. Raistlin Magia is probably the one character that really sticks out. It's probably everyone's favourite from these stories. It is a mage who is very weak and, basically is coughing the whole time, can barely stand. He's been cursed with hourglass eyes because he sort of was punished, and everything he sees death, so he sees everything aging in front of him, and so he is basically a wizard who everyone knows is going to be super powerful, but everyone kind of fears him and fears that he might become the bad guy. And across this journey you see his evolution to the forces of darkness and so on. This novel is just, for me, nostalgia personified, and I've read this a bunch of times, and every time I do, it's a warm, cozy place to me, and so it's my number one book. If I had any criticisms of it, which there are many, it is that the writing is kind of childish. There's a character in it called Tasselhoff Burfoot, who is a Kender, which is basically like a hobbit. I couldn't stand that character as a kid. I can't stand that character now. I remember reading this book a few years ago and just almost wanted to skip that character. And he's a lot of people's favourites, but for me, Tasselhoff was this comic relief that just killed any tension. So the characters would be sort of about to be destroyed by a scary dragon in a sort of dark temple. But because Kender have no fear of dragons, he'd say something like, "Oh wow, there's a dragon up there. What are we going to do, guys? Ha ha ha!" And it felt like, whoa, this is really out of place. And that really sort of felt like that came from the D&D campaign. But I didn't like the character, even though Tasselhoff evolves a little bit and learns fear towards the end. It still just felt like an unnecessary tonal shift that I didn't like. I don't really like comic relief in movies unless it's done really well. The sort of Marvelification of stories where everyone's wisecracking and so on. That is the one negative about this book. But yeah, Dragonlance Chronicles, there are many Dragonlance books. There is dozens and dozens of very varying quality. I read the Chronicles, the Legends, and there were some short stories. I've read all those, but didn't get much further than that. But the Chronicles, my number one fantasy novel, and even funny enough, when I look at it now, I kind of go, is that really my number one? But as the introduction that took me to the world of fantasy, I can't go past it. Thank you so much for being with me today. I hope you've enjoyed this little half an hour look into the books I like to read. Not the only books I like to read. My wife is a voracious reader, and she reads 50 or more books a year. She read 50 last year, and then also threw in War and Peace at the end. The best books my wife reads, she gives to me to read. So I also read proper novels like Pachinko, or A Fine Balance, or what was I reading the other day? Sapiens, a non-fiction book, that kind of thing. So I'm not just only limiting myself to fantasy novels, but as a sort of a comfort food, fantasy novels I like to come back to and read a couple every year. I'm reading the Abercrombie books right now, and when I go through those, I sort of read one or two, and then I go back and read a sort of real world story, or a biography or historical novel, that kind of thing, because it's good to mix it up. If you only sort of dip yourself in one well, what's the analogy? That well's a terrible analogy, but if you only eat one cuisine, you're going to get sick of it. And it's good to, read stories from all parts of the world, all genres, or most genres, maybe not sort of like, high school romance, that kind of thing, whatever it is, or My Little Pony stuff, but it's good to broaden your horizons. But as far as fantasy novels go, those ones I highly recommend, and I look forward to hearing yours in the comments below. Until next time, my friends, I am of course Oliver Joyce from Whiskeybarrel Studios, and bye for now.